Some secrets aren't protected by armed guards or vault doors. They're protected by the assumption that no one would believe them even if they were true. For most of my life, that assumption worked. I stayed quiet. Like everyone else who signed the same papers, sat in the same rooms, and learned the same lesson. Some things you carry to the grave. My name is Richard J. Wolfe, former serviceman, United States Air Force. I wasn't a scientist, I wasn't a strategist, and I wasn't one of the men who decided what the public deserved to know. I was the kind of man the system prefers, someone who followed instructions, kept records, moved information from one place to another, and didn't ask questions that slowed things down. For decades, that was enough, until I saw a document that wasn't meant to pass through my hands. Not officially, not permanently, just long enough to be moved from one secure channel to another, long enough for someone like me to log it, verify the routing, and forget about it. That's how the system works. You see something for less than a minute, you log a number, you move it forward, and then it disappears back into the machinery. Except this one didn't disappear, not from my mind. The document didn't contain photographs, no diagrams, no sensational language. Just a quiet classification header and a sentence that changed the way I understood the last 40 years of silence. It said, in language so dry it almost felt casual, "Assessment indicates that the People's Republic of China may have successfully replicated non-human technological architecture recovered during prior United States retrieval operations." I read that line twice, then a third time. When you work inside classified systems long enough, you learn to recognize the difference between speculation and confirmation. Speculation uses words like possible, unverified, theoretical. Confirmation uses words like indicates, and that word was there for a reason, because whoever wrote that document wasn't guessing. They were reporting something that had already happened. That was the moment I realized something the public still hasn't fully grasped. The secrecy surrounding non-human technology was never just about the existence of the technology itself. It was about control. Control over who understands it. Control over who can build it. Control over who gets there first. For years, people imagined these secrets as dusty artifacts hidden in underground hangars somewhere in Nevada. But that's not how it works. Artifacts are only the beginning. The real race begins after the recovery, after the scientists start taking things apart, after the engineers stop asking where the technology came from and start asking how it works, and eventually, how to reproduce it. I didn't know where the original materials were stored. That information never crossed my desk. But the language in that document made one thing very clear. At some point in the past, long before I ever entered the Air Force, something had been recovered. Not detected, not theorized. Recovered. Physical. Real. Studied. And according to that report, China may have reached a point the United States never expected anyone else to reach. Replication. I remember the room where I read it. Small, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead. Two other personnel working terminals across the floor, both focused on their own tasks. No drama, no alarms. Just a quiet office where information passed through like water through pipes. But the moment I finished reading that line, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear. Something heavier than that. Recognition. Because that sentence explained too many things. It explained the sudden changes in certain defense briefings I had seen in later years. It explained the sudden urgency in programs that had previously moved at a careful, deliberate pace. And most of all, it explained why some projects that had been buried for decades suddenly started receiving attention again. If China had actually replicated even a fraction of what had been recovered, then the balance everyone believed existed didn't exist anymore. But here's the part that stayed with me the longest. The document never said how China obtained the knowledge. It didn't say whether they recovered their own materials, or whether they learned by studying ours, or whether someone somewhere talked. You might assume that would be the most important question, but inside classified systems, questions like that rarely appear in the documents, because by the time a report like that is written, someone already knows the answer. They just aren't writing it down. I logged the document. I forwarded it through the secure channel exactly as instructed, and officially, that was the last time I ever saw it. But something happens when you read a line that can't be unread. You start replaying every strange instruction you followed, every sealed crate you helped move, every facility that had tighter security than its purpose seemed to justify. For most of my career, I believed the silence surrounding those operations existed to protect the public from panic. That's what we were told. That's what we repeated to ourselves. But the older I get, the more I realize the silence wasn't protecting the public at all. It was protecting something else, something much more fragile. Because if another nation really has managed to replicate technology that wasn't built by human hands, then the question isn't whether governments have been hiding the truth. The question is much simpler. Who's already using it? And how long it's been happening without anyone outside those rooms noticing. People imagine secrecy as a locked door, a vault, a password, a red stamp on a folder. But the real mechanism is much simpler than that. You divide the truth into pieces so small that no one person ever sees the whole shape. When I entered the Air Force, no one sat me down and explained that system. No one needed to. He learned it slowly, assignment by assignment, facility by facility. He learned that some locations appeared on maps but not on paperwork. He learned that certain cargo flights had no manifest that anyone could access. And you learned that sometimes your job was simply to be present while something moved from one sealed container to another. No questions, just signatures. My role wasn't glamorous. Most of the time it involved documentation and verification, confirming the movement of materials between secured locations. But if you stay in that system long enough, patterns start to appear. You notice that certain operations involve security layers that make no sense for ordinary hardware. You notice that the personnel attached to those operations often don't introduce themselves fully. Sometimes they don't introduce themselves at all. I remember one transfer in particular. It happened years before the document I told you about. At the time, I didn't understand why it felt different. The container arrived late at night on a transport aircraft that wasn't scheduled on the base movement logs I had access to. That alone wasn't unusual. Black flights happen more often than people realize. But what stood out was the security protocol. The aircraft wasn't parked near the usual restricted hangars. Instead, it was directed to a temporary perimeter, floodlights, mobile fencing, and a security cordon staffed by personnel whose uniforms carried no visible identifiers. No unit patches, no name tapes, just subdued Air Force insignia. Even then, I understood the message. This wasn't a normal chain of command. When the container came down the ramp, it wasn't large, about the size of a shipping crate you might see in any industrial facility. But it was sealed inside a secondary casing, heavy, reinforced, with vibration-dampening mounts bolted around the exterior. I signed the transfer sheet without being told what the contents were. That was standard procedure. But I noticed something in the documentation that stayed with me. The cargo classification didn't match any category I had seen before. Not weapons, not experimental equipment, not classified electronics. The category simply read, recovered materials, non-conventional origin. At the time, I assumed it was a code phrase for foreign technology, captured hardware, something taken from another nation's program. That explanation was easy, comfortable. It kept everything inside the boundaries of things that made sense. But years later, when I saw that document mentioning non-human technological architecture, the memory of that crate came back with a weight it didn't have before, because suddenly the wording matched, too closely. The men overseeing the transfer didn't speak much. One of them watched every movement I made while signing the chain of custody form. Not aggressively, just carefully, like someone making sure a process happened exactly as designed. When the container was finally loaded onto the transport vehicle that would take it to its next location, I asked a question I probably shouldn't have asked. It wasn't a direct question, just a small comment. Something like, "This must be important equipment." The officer standing near the vehicle looked at me for a moment. Then he said something I never forgot. Not angry, not threatening, just matter of fact. He said, "Airman, the most important equipment is the kind you never learn about." Then he closed the folder and walked away. That was the end of the interaction. No warning, no reprimand. But the message was clear. Curiosity had boundaries. For the next several years, I continued doing exactly what I had always done. Logging movements, signing transfers, watching sealed cargo disappear into facilities that had more layers of security than their official purpose justified. And like most people inside that system, I convinced myself that whatever those operations involved, someone above my level understood it. Someone had the full picture. That belief makes the silence easier. It allows you to think you're just one small part of a larger machine that's under control. But the document I told you about, the one mentioning China, shattered that belief. Because if another country truly replicated technology recovered during those earlier operations, then maybe the people in charge never understood it as well as they thought. Or maybe they understood it perfectly, and simply lost control of who else would eventually learn the same things. And once that kind of knowledge spreads, there's no way to lock it back inside a crate. There's a strange thing that happens when you spend years inside classified environments. Certain words start appearing in conversations that you will never hear outside those rooms. Not dramatic words, not the kind people write books about. Quiet words, administrative words, terms that sound harmless unless you understand what they're referring to. Recovery, material transfer, non-conventional origin. Those phrases drift through paperwork like ordinary inventory labels. But once you've seen them enough times, you realize they're placeholders. Language designed to describe something without ever naming it. When I first joined the Air Force, I believed the classification system existed to protect national security in the traditional sense. Weapons capabilities, surveillance systems, experimental aircraft. And some of it absolutely was that. But every once in a while, a term would appear in documentation that didn't belong to any of those categories. At first, I ignored it. Most people did. Because ignoring things is how you stay comfortable in that system. But the longer you stay around those operations, the more difficult it becomes to pretend those words don't mean anything, especially when they start appearing in places where they shouldn't. Years before the document mentioning China crossed my terminal, there had already been quiet shifts inside certain programs, budget reallocations, facilities reopening after years of inactivity, personnel reassigned to projects whose descriptions were deliberately vague. You wouldn't notice these things unless you were already paying attention. But I had been around long enough to recognize when something old was being revived. And when something classified is revived after decades, it usually means someone discovered something new about it. That's the part the public rarely understands. The story people imagine, crashed craft, hidden hangars, secret autopsies, is the part that gets the attention. But that's only the beginning of the process. The real story is what happens afterward. Years of analysis, attempts to understand materials that behave in ways our engineering models don't predict, power systems that don't resemble anything inside our known technological frameworks. You might assume progress would happen quickly once scientists start examining something like that. But from what I observed, progress was slow, painfully slow. Sometimes entire projects would stall for years because no one could figure out how a single component worked. And then, occasionally, something would change. A breakthrough, a partial understanding. Just enough progress to keep the program alive. Those were the moments when the quiet urgency returned. And that urgency was present again in the years leading up to the document I saw. Briefings became shorter, more restricted. Certain facilities began limiting access even further. The language in internal communication shifted from research to assessment. That's when I started realizing something uncomfortable. If the United States had been studying non-human technology for decades and still struggled to fully understand it, then any nation that suddenly replicated part of it had achieved something extraordinary. Not by accident, not through guesswork, but through a sustained effort to break open a puzzle that had resisted explanation for generations. And that's why the sentence in that document felt so heavy. It wasn't just a report, it was an admission. Because buried inside that one line was a realization that no one wanted to say out loud. The monopoly was gone. For years, secrecy had created the illusion that control still existed, that whatever had been recovered remained locked inside American laboratories, studied under strict supervision. But if China had actually replicated even a fraction of that technology, then the situation had already changed. Quietly, irreversibly. And the public still had no idea the race had even started. What I keep asking myself now, years later, is something no briefing ever answered. Did China learn by recovering something of their own? Or did they learn by studying something that was never supposed to leave our control? Because the deeper I think about the programs I brushed against during my time in the Air Force, the more I realize something unsettling. The system was designed to protect secrets from the public. But systems built that way often overlook another risk entirely. They forget that secrets can leak sideways, between agencies, between contractors, between nations that are watching more closely than anyone realizes. And once knowledge like that begins to spread, classification stamps stop meaning very much. People like to believe that the most dangerous secrets are hidden behind steel doors. They imagine underground vaults, guards, encrypted servers. But after a lifetime around classified systems, I can tell you something that rarely gets said out loud. The real protection isn't the vault, it's the silence, not forced silence, learned silence. The kind that settles into people after years of understanding that certain questions lead nowhere good. When I retired from the Air Force, I told myself I was leaving all of that behind. That whatever those operations involved would continue without me, handled by younger personnel who would eventually learn the same lesson every one of us learned. Do your job, log the information, move it forward, and don't carry it home with you. For a long time that worked. Years passed. The memories of sealed containers, strange classification terms, and restricted facilities faded into something distant. Until the world started changing. Until I began hearing discussions about emerging technologies that didn't seem to follow the normal path of development. Propulsion theories appearing suddenly in research papers. Energy systems that hinted at breakthroughs no one could explain clearly. At first I told myself it was coincidence. Scientific progress happens in waves. But then I started noticing something else. The language in defense reports began shifting. Not publicly. Inside the smaller circles where analysts talk to each other, where quiet concerns surface before they reach headlines. The tone was different, less confident, more cautious. And every time I heard those conversations, that sentence from the document would come back to me. China may have successfully replicated non-human technological architecture. People assume that if something like that were true, the government would respond with panic. Emergency briefings, public warnings. But that's not how systems like this behave. Panic draws attention. Attention leads to questions. And questions lead to places no one wants the public looking. So the silence continues. Programs shift quietly. Budgets move. Research accelerates behind closed doors. And the world keeps turning as if nothing fundamental has changed. But if you spend enough time inside those rooms, you begin to understand something the public rarely considers. The real fear was never that people would discover non-human technology existed. Eventually that truth would surface one way or another. The real fear was losing control over who understood it. Because once another nation reaches the same knowledge, the balance disappears. And balance, more than secrecy, is what kept the situation stable. I think about that crate sometimes, the one labeled recovered materials, non-conventional origin. Back then it was just another transfer in a long chain of transfers, another sealed container moving quietly through the night. But now I wonder where it ended up, which laboratory, which team of scientists, how many years they spent trying to understand what was inside, and whether the knowledge they gained stayed where it was supposed to stay. Because history has a pattern. Every powerful technology humanity has ever discovered eventually spreads beyond the people who first controlled it. Nuclear physics, computing, spaceflight, it never remains isolated forever. So if non-human technology was ever truly understood, even partially, then it was only a matter of time before someone else reached the same conclusions. Maybe China did it through their own recovery. Maybe they solved the engineering puzzle independently. Or maybe the knowledge slipped through the cracks in ways no one predicted. I don't know which of those explanations is true, but I do know something else. When I saw that document, the reaction around me wasn't disbelief. No one treated it like a wild theory. No one laughed. They processed it the same way they would process any other intelligence report. Quietly, professionally, as if the possibility had been anticipated for a long time. And that's the part that still unsettles me. Because if the people writing those reports were already prepared for the moment another nation replicated that technology, then they must have understood something about it long before the public even suspected it existed. Something important enough to protect with decades of silence. Something important enough that even now, most of the world still doesn't realize the question isn't whether non-human technology has been recovered. The real question is much harder to face. How many nations are studying it now, and how long they've been doing it without telling anyone?